Howdy, this is Professor Wei Li, recording from College Station. In previous lectures, we have talked about a brief history of transportation planning and development, and also we have reviewed the current trends of urban travel. In today's lecture, we are going to focus on transportation planning process. So we will first provide more details about the federal planning requirements. In the last lecture, we introduced a general policy context, and today we can provide more details about the federal planning requirements. And then we're going to spend a lot of time on the urban transportation planning process, and the four-step model will be the core of this element. And then we will introduce how government and citizens are involved in the transportation planning. So now let's go to the federal planning requirements. The first requirements that we are going to talk about is the Clean Air Act. We know in 1970, the original Clean Air Act identified vehicles as the major contributor to the nation's air pollution problem. 20 years later, the 1990 amendment was a major improvement to this Clean Air Act. So what is the improvement? What is the improvement? So first, it requires Environmental Protection Agency to set a national ambient air quality standards, or the NAAQS. So there are 6 criterion pollutants. We have provided a table here, and this table lists the levels and standards for the 6 criterion pollutants. They are the carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, particle pollution, and sulfur dioxide. And these standards are the same to all places, all cities in the US. Basically, from a public health perspective and equitable perspective, because no matter you live in New York City or you live in California or live in Texas, your health is considered to be the equally important. So you deserve to breathe the same quality of air. So once such standards are established, there are some areas whose air quality is good enough, such as Montana, or there are some places whose air quality is not as good as the standard, such as Los Angeles Basin. So there are these 2 types of areas are called attainment areas and non-attainment areas. The attainment areas are fine, but for the non-attainment areas, they're going to have some problem because they will need to make plans to improve their air quality to reach such a standard. They should integrate their transportation planning and the clean air planning at the region level. So MPOs, when they make their transportation plans, they should incorporate such air quality goals. They need to make a plan to improve the air quality and meet attainment goals according to a certain deadline. The killing point of this act is that if a region cannot show attainment by the deadlines for certain type of pollution, the federal funds for transportation may be withheld. So it can be a big financial concern for the region if they do not meet the attainment goals. And how do these regions show that their transportation control measures can meet or can help them to achieve these goals? So they will run the emission models, and one of the very most widely used emission model is called MOVES, or MOVES, MOVES. So the full name of this model is called Motor Vehicle Emissions Simulator. It was developed by the Environmental Protection Agency. So the MPOs, they use these emission models to show that there are different measures such as the peak hour tolls, the parking charges, and fuel taxes, bike and pedestrian facilities, how these measures will help them to achieve the air quality goals. The Clean Air Act has been considered to be a very successful act to help improve the nation's air quality. This graph shows the growth and emissions during the past 20 years of time, basically from 1990 to 2008. So during these 18 years of time, the GDP increased at 64%. The vehicle miles traveled increased at 36%. So more cars are running on the road, and the population has increased by about 20%. But let's look at the pollution. So the carbon dioxide has basically stayed at the same level, and the aggregate emissions from the 6 criterion pollutants have decreased by 40%. And this table, we provide more quantitative evidence about the success of the Clean Air Act. And this table considers a larger span. It's from 1980 to 2008. So during this 28 years of time, we have 2 columns here. This column is the percentage of change in the ambient air for each criterion pollutant. And this column shows the the change of annual emissions for each criterion pollutant. So as we can see, in terms of ambient air, the carbon monoxide has decreased by 80%, and the lead has decreased by 92%. And the decrease in lead was basically because of the requirement of installing the catalytic converters, and also the use of unleaded gasolines. So the emission rate for lead decreased by almost 100%, and emissions of carbon monoxide decreased by 58%. And we know that the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, or IST, made in 1991, posed a major change to transportation planning and policy as the first U.S. federal legislation on this subject in the post-interstate highway system era. It requires that the transportation agencies must plan for all travel modes, not only vehicle driving. And MPOs must consult with other agencies and interest groups on scenarios, modeling methods, and indicators. And planning process must be recertified every 3 years. And the Transportation Equity Act in the 21st century, or the T21, passed in 1998, and the Safe, Accountable, Flexible, Efficient Transportation Equity Act, a Legacy for Users, or Safety Law, passed in 2005. These two, they basically, T21 and the Safety Law, they followed a similar philosophy as the 1991 IST. And the funds that were once reserved for highway projects can be used for all surface modes of transportation, even including walking, biking, and public transit. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the implication of this act to transportation planning is that the metropolitan planning organizations, they should take equity seriously, and agencies cannot discriminate against minorities in transit services, and agencies must consider the effects of all projects and plans on minorities and on lower income households. And based on the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, the Environmental Protection Agency, they made a guideline in 1998 about environmental justice practice in federal transportation project and agencies. So basically, Environmental justice issues are dealing with the distribution of negative effects among all groups. For example, when we plan a route of a new railway line, the planning agency must consider the racial ethnicity components of the neighborhoods where the proposed line runs into. The agency has to show that the different racial ethnicity groups were impacted equally. And the consideration of environmental justice or the distribution of negative effects among all groups has become a common practice for the NPOs. And the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, requires that the NPOs must consider the growth-inducing impacts of all projects. For example, if you have a project and that will induce travel, and improvement of transportation facility will also cause the induced land development. Okay, now let's switch gear and talk about the urban transportation planning process. So a general urban transportation planning process includes 3 phases. The first phase is the pre-analysis phase. The second phase is the technical analysis phase, and the third phase is the post-analysis phase. And such a diagram works really well for most medium and large-sized NPOs and for modeling travels and land uses. The pre-analysis phase includes problem identification, the formulation of objectives, data collection methods, and generation of alternatives, and a definition of evaluation measures. The most important aspect of this phase is to define problems broadly and then identify broad objectives. In this way, many solutions can be sought, not just increasing the road capacity. So when formulating the objectives, instead of saying, okay, we'd like to widen the congested roadways, we should say we want to maximize accessibility in the region, especially for lower income households. The data collection should be carried out every 10 years. Based on most NPOs, they carry out their household travel surveys to understand the changing trends and the characteristics of how residents travel in their region. So they do the survey every 10 years. And we also know that we have the decennial census, which provides the changing dynamics of demographics every 10 years of time. The generation of alternatives is usually a weak step. In the official plan, the NPOs usually analyze only the preferred plan and a no-action alternative. So there are only 2 alternatives, preferred plan and a no-action alternative. And the no-action alternative is required by the National Environmental Policy Act. The preferred plan, in many instances, seems to be the maximum investment in roads, where the plan can just meet the future emissions requirements. And between the maximum investment and the no action, there are some other alternatives. But because the National Environmental Policy Act does not require the analysis of more alternatives, the NPOs, they usually only analyze these 2 plans, the preferred versus the no action. The NPOs, when they make their plans, they follow the laws very strictly. So basically, you can find that their goals and objectives are very closely connected to the planning factor set by the law. And this we have presented an example of the Bryan College Station Metropolitan Transportation Plan from 2010 to 2035. So on the left column are the safety loop planning factors, and on the right-hand side is the Bryan College Station Metropolitan Transportation Plan goals. So as we can see that they established a close matching between their goals and those planning factors. So they So they do make the plans according to the requirements by the law. They don't do anything that do not seem to be necessary. In terms of the evaluation measures, the required measures are the congestion and the delay time. The measures on equity or aggregate economic welfare are urged and necessary, but they're not required by law. So we can see from here, in terms of the goals, equity and the economic welfare is not well represented. The technical analysis phase includes activity forecasts and the 4 steps of modeling: travel, the trip generation, trip distribution, mode choice, and traffic assignment. And also includes the emission modeling, which we introduced in the past based on the requirement of the Clean Air Act. The activity forecasts are carried out before running the 4-step model. The MPOs, they need data about the location of different households and employment for the base year and for the forecast years. The base year data are basically collected from the census, and the forecast data come from the state or federal government input-output models. So the trip generation, trip distribution, mode choice, and traffic assignments, these 4 steps are called the 4-step model, and it is the core of transportation planning and modeling process. The emission modeling can help the MPOs to translate vehicle volume into emission data. And the MPOs need to use this data to demonstrate that their transportation planning can help them to meet the clean air planning goals. And the next slide, we're going to introduce the core of the technical analysis phase, and this is the 4-step modeling. It is also called the Urban Transportation Model System, or the UTMS. It began with the travel demand models in 1950s and then became formalized in 1960s when the US DOT codified the practice and the software required by this model. As a MPO, they need to understand the transportation system characteristics and land use characteristics in their region. So before they go to the 4-step modeling process, they divide their regions into different zones, or called traffic analysis zones. Basically, each MPO can have from 100 to maybe 2,000 zones. And those zones generally are composed of census tracts or census block groups. So the MPO, they need to make 20-year projections of future land uses in small zones throughout the region. And for each small area, the MPO will project the number of households which generate trips and the number of employees which will attract trips. So they will also develop a set of networks that represent all the major roads and all transit lines. And trips are assigned to a network of roads that connect the different zones. So after the modeling process, the outputs of this modeling will be the traffic flows on the network links. That includes the quantity, which is the volume, and also the quality, which is the speed on the network. When MPOs apply for federal highway and transit fundings, they need to demonstrate that their analysis is based on the 4-step modeling process, or the UTMS. The 4-step model is a central part of transportation planning, and it includes the codified methods required by at the federal level. So the first step is the trip generation model. So the trip generation model, they analyze household characteristics and they determine the number of trips the household makes per week based on different characteristics such as the income, the size of the household, and number of kids in this household, and so on and so forth. The second step is the trip distribution model. So in this process, they will analyze how the trips are generated by the households and attracted by the employment. And the third step is the mode choice model. So basically, they will consider the mode choice as a function of available modes, the household income, and the cost of the mode. A discrete choice model is basically employed for understanding the mode choices in the region. And the fourth step is a route assignment model. So basically, this process will predict how trips are assigned to the networks. In the next few slides, we will provide some more details for each of the four steps. So the first step, the trip generation. We have a graph here. It is one of the traffic analysis zone or a TAZ zone. When we do analysis, we need to understand the socio-demographic characteristics of this zone, such as the income, the number of vehicles, number of workers, number of jobs, household size, and so on. And we assume that these socio-demographic characteristics will help us to project the number of weekday trips that a household will produce in this zone. So we can understand and project the trips produced from this zone and the trips that are attracted to this zone. So this is the first step. So after we understand how trips are generated from this each zone, we will need to understand how the trips take place from one zone to another. So in other words, we need to understand how to match trip origins to trip destinations. And this graph helps us to understand how the trip distribution take place. So we suppose that the city has three zones right here, zone 1, 2, and 3. And there are certain trips which take place from zone 1 to zone 2 and from zone 1 to zone 3. Also, there are trips that take place also between zone 2 and zone 3. So in this table, we list the number of trips for each pair of zones. So for example, in zone 1, there are 183 trips that take place within this zone, and there are 784 trips that take place from zone 1 and to zone 2, and there are 939 trips that take place from zone 1 to zone 3. So now the question is, how do we predict where each trip goes? From the first step, we understand how trips are generated by the household characteristics and attracted by employment. So here we can randomly link the trips from one zone to another, and we can then calibrate to match the trip time length obtained from the travel survey. So the trip distribution is most often performed in urban area models by a technique called the gravity model. So the principle for the gravity model is pretty straightforward. So if there is a large number of trips between pairs of zones, when the trip productions in the pair are large, and there is a large number of trips between pairs of zones when the trip attractions in a pair are large, and there is a large number of trips between pairs of zones when there is a little separation between the zones. For example, if the two zones are very close to each other, then there is a larger number of trips between this pair of zones. So this is the step number 2. It helps us to project where the trip goes within the zone and between different zones. The third step is the mode choice step. So the mode choice models assume that travelers choose the best mode for themselves by weighing the characteristics of the trips for all available modes. And this graph can show that in order to travel from this zone to this zone, automobile, train, and airlines are all available. As a traveler, you will make your choice based on your characteristics such as your income, your valuation of time, and based on the availability of different modes. A common used method in this mode choice modeling process is to utilize the discrete choice modeling. So discrete choice modeling is a method that can predict the probability of choosing a certain mode based on the characteristics of different of the traveler and availability of different modes. The final step in the Ford modeling process is called traffic assignment or the route assignment. So basically in this step, a modeler will need to assign the trips along the street or public transit network. And the network is such assignment is chosen so that the travel time is minimized in this network. Because between point A to point B on a certain network, there are different routes. There are some short paths and there are some longer paths. When a lot of trips are assigned to the similar path, then the travel speed may be slowed down. So in that case, we will need to choose some different path. So under the constraint of the total network capacity, we can achieve equilibrium so that the travel time is minimized. So the above are the 4-step modeling process. If you're interested in the technical aspect of transportation planning, I would encourage you to choose the course offered at Texas A&M University, and that course is called Transportation System Analysis. And that course focuses on how to carry out the 4-step modeling. In 1950s and 1960s, the problem for transportation modeling is pretty simple. It is about where to provide new freeways and highways. As a transportation professional, their jobs is to determine the most congested corridors. They only need trip distribution and route assignment models, and the results from those trip distribution and route assignment models had just to be roughly right. Trip generation and mode choice do not need to be very accurate. And right now, partly due to the advancement in computing, and more MPOs, they use these aggregate discrete choice models for mode choices. So larger cities which have bus lines and railway systems, they're increasingly use these aggregate discrete choice models to understand how residents make choices from different modes and how the trips are assigned to their network. But for smaller cities, they usually do not use these aggregate models because basically for smaller cities there aren't many different modes for residents to choose. Driving is pretty much the dominant mode of transportation. Land use and transportation are very closely related to each other, and this graph shows the land market and the transportation market. As we can see here, the interactions between transportation and land use lies in that the increased improvement of transportation will increase the accessibility of certain areas, and that will make changes, will induce land development in that area. And the land development and increase the population density and employment density, they will also call for increased investment in transportation. According to a study by Rodier et al. In 2001, the land use effects, they contributed to about 15% to the vehicle miles traveled difference between the no-build and maximum freeway expansion scenarios. The MPOs across the country have increasingly integrated land use and transportation. For example, the MPO in Portland, Oregon found that if they use the land use models, their results from the travel model are more reasonable in terms of economic theory and common sense. So integrated model sometimes generates significantly lower congestion levels because the firms, they will choose to move outward to take advantage of the less congested conditions. So in other words, if we only focus on the four-step modeling without the consideration of the land use, then our model may produce exaggerated projections on congestion. The third phase in urban transportation planning is the post-analysis phase, and this phase includes plan evaluation, plan implementation, and monitoring of results. There are four major evaluation measures. They are the effectiveness, efficiency, equity, and environmental. The effectiveness is about how the transportation system meets its intended objectives. Efficiency is about how much a transportation investment costs in relation to the benefits it provides. Equity is about a fairness with which benefits are delivered and costs are imposed on the many communities in the society, and environmental deals with how the projects and how the plan considers the on-road emissions and energy consumption. But recently, the environmental perspective are broadened to include the water runoff from the transportation infrastructure and also the habitat damage and impacts based on the proposed transportation projects. Plan implementation is a complex political process. It involves many stakeholders and balances of interests. The monitoring of results is pretty easy to understand. It focuses on the objectives and goals set in the plan. So in this flow of different processes in transportation planning, various governmental agencies are involved, from US DOT to state DOT to MPOs to local governments and through to transit agencies. So let's briefly talk about what each type of government agency does. The US DOT is at the highest level. They oversees the transportation planning and project activities of MPOs and state DOTs, and they provide the training and funding needed for transportation projects. The state DOTs are the largest units of government that develop transportation plans and projects. They are responsible for setting the goals for the state, and they work with all the state transportation organizations and local governments in planning a safe and efficient transportation system between the cities. The MPOs are possibly the most important governmental agency in transportation planning. All areas with more than 50,000 population should have MPO. The policy board is comprised of local elected officials, and they set the policy for the MPO. Other groups can also influence the direction of the MPO's decision making. So the MPOs, they provide short and long-term solutions to transportation concerning the whole region. The local government, they perform many transportation functions, such as scheduling improvements and maintenance for the local streets and roads. So the transit agencies, they can be public and they can be private. So they basically their job is to operate the public transit system. In the next few slides, we are going to focus on the core functions of the MPOs, or Metropolitan Planning Organizations. So the MPOs, they establish and manage a fair and impartial setting for effective regional decision making in the metropolitan area. So the MPO identifies and evaluates alternative transportation improvement options. They use data and planning methods to generate and evaluate different alternatives. So they perform the planning studies and evaluations as part of the UPWP program, or the Unified Planning Work Program. In addition, they prepare and maintain a Metropolitan Planning Transportation Plan, or the MTP. So the MPO develops and updates a long-range transportation plan for the metropolitan area, covering a planning horizon of at least 20 years of time. And that plan forecasts the mobility and access for people and goods. And the plan fosters efficient system performance and preservation, and the plan should also fosters the good quality of life. So that is about the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. So that's a long-range plan, at least 20 years of time. But at the finer scale, the MPO also develops a short-range program, basically the 4-year program for transportation improvements. So the transportation and improvement program, this 4-year or short-range program, is based on the long-range transportation plan. This TIP should be designed to achieve the area's goals using spending, regulating, operating, management, and financial tools. Another big chunk of the MPO's job is to involve the public. It's to involve the general public and other effective constituencies in the 4 essential functions listed above. So the 4 core functions: establish a setting, identify and evaluate alternative transportation improvement options, prepare and maintain MTP, or the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, and develop a transportation improvement program as a short-range improvement plan. In this slide, we are going to briefly introduce the key products from MPOs and state DOTs. Each row represents one product. So the first product is the UPWP, or Unified Planning Work Program, and this is a short-range program. Every 1 or 2 years, MPO will hire consultants or their own research staff to perform planning studies and to understand the current needs of transportation planning, and understand the current issues in transportation and urban planning and land use as well. So that requires annual update. And the second row is the MTP, or the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. It is a long range, at least 20 years of range. It should list the future goals, strategies, and projects. And that is developed by the MPO and also approved by the MPO. It has to be updated every 5 years in general. Based on this long-range plan, the MPO, they will develop the TIP, or Transportation Improvement Program. So every 4 years of time, the MPO will develop this TIP, and that has to be approved by either MPO or the governor in the state. The major focus of TIP is about where to make investments in the transportation infrastructure, and the TIP will need to be updated every 4 years of time. At the state level, the state DOT, they have two products which have their equivalent counterpart at the MPO level. So the LRSTP, or the Long Range Statewide Transportation Plan, is long range transportation plan, similar to the MPO's MTP. This LRSTP has at least a 20 years of horizon. It should stipulate the future goals, strategies, and projects for the state. And based on this long-range state transportation plan, there is a short-range, state STIP, or statewide transportation improvement plan, and that is similar to the TIP by the MPO level. It is developed every 4 years of time, and the STIP is a key program for the state to allocate financial resources to make transportation investments. It is hard to evaluate if MPO is doing a good job or not, but generally speaking, there are some good practice guidelines for the medium-sized and large MPOs. So we're going to spend a couple of minutes and talk about what are the general good practices for the MPOs. So basically, they will need to have their plan needs to have a good time representation to include both the peak hour analysis and off-peak hour analysis. In terms of data collection, MPO generally they will need to perform the household travel survey for every 10 years, and they should also have the travel speed surveys. In terms of activity forecasts, MPO is generally rely on the GIS land use model, or GIS represents the Geographic Information System. So this model and also considers the urban economic model. And in terms of the discrete choice model, to understand the mode choices, MPO should at least consider the auto ownership, and because the auto ownership plays a very important part in people's residents' choice of different mode. And also they should consider the land use, parking cost, and accessibility issues by different mode. In the 4-step modeling process, MPO, in terms of the first step, the trip generation step, the MPO's good practice should include walk and bike modes, and should include more trip purposes, should consider the auto ownership, and should consider the at least 3 or more time periods of time. 3 means the peak, off-peak hour, and another peak hour, or they should have more time periods in their analysis. And for the trip distribution, the MPO's modeling technicians should consider the full model equilibration, should include all modes and all costs. In terms of the third step, the mode choice, MPOs generally now rely on the discrete choice models, and they will include various land use variables for understanding residents' choice of the non-driving modes, such as the public transit, walking, and biking modes. Those land use variables, such as the density of sidewalks, the street connectivity, and whether the land use are mixed or not, they play a very important part sometimes in influence people's choices over the transit and walking and biking modes. In terms of the assignment, the last step, MPOs, when they do the transportation modeling, they will consider the whole capacity of the network, and they will well calibrate the speeds for different links, and they will consider 3 or more time periods of time in terms of deciding and calculating the equilibrium. Citizens are also active player in transportation planning. As we know, a lot of regional transportation projects may produce the adverse effects on communities, such as the air pollution, noise pollution, vibration, or some safety hazard. So the planning authorities, they increasingly feel that they're struggling in the planning process because they have various responsibilities, from technical responsibility to the responsiveness to federal and state statutes, and they have the local responsibility, and they have to be responsible for the local citizens. So this graph shows a proposed intermodal project in the Southern California area. And so basically, the BNSF is proposing to build an intermodal facility so that they can the goods from Los Angeles and Long Beach port will be shipped to this intermodal facility on rail, and then it can be shipped to the rest of the country through other different modes. And this project is supposed to reduce the truck traffic from the ports to downtown Los Angeles. It could be a very good project, but the local residents, a lot of them do not want to build a major transportation facility in their neighborhood, and this sign shows their attitudes. They want to stop this project. And last year, in the Occupy movement, so those citizens from this area, they went ahead and they occupied the Los Angeles port and the Long Beach port to express their views. So in the transportation planning process, local authorities, planning authorities should be sensitive to the local views. And it is not easy to make everybody pleased. So it is not easy to achieve effectiveness, efficiency, and equity in transportation planning, because different people, different interest groups have different definition for those evaluation measures. People often disagree for many reasons regarding what should be done in any particular situation, like should we build a new road or not? Should the bikers be encouraged on a given route or not? Should social service agencies help the poor people buy cars or help them use the public transit more effectively? So transportation systems usually depend on interactions of many indifferent individuals and organizations associated with vehicle makers, users, local roads and arterial roads. Many groups work hard to influence transportation policies and choices, such as the AAA, the auto clubs, the environmental organizations, or the labor unions. And diverse groups have competing purposes. So therefore, change does not occur very rapidly. It is happening gradually. And any change creates losers and winners. And the balancing and fighting between different groups will make this process not easy and quick and rapid process as what is happening in China. So in the system here is a democratic system, has some cost. So in conclusion, the transportation planning process is highly technical and highly political. So now I want you guys to think, how do MPOs promote their visions and make changes in a complex political system. And that concludes this lecture. Thank you.